use for future information, etc. So the idea of this afternoon's session was following conversations with ourselves from Forest for Cornwall and Cornwall ANOB. We thought it'd be really useful to speak to partners within both Cornwall County Council and external people to have a chat about various different approaches to tree planting and how it impacts on the various specialisms that people represent here today. So just in terms of coordination, we've got a lot of people on the call, and also I'm sure lots of questions to be asked and quite a tight agenda. So Joe Harris from Forest for Cornwall team is going to kick off with us and talk about Forest for Cornwall, our offer, tree planting offer. We've got Cornwall ANOB speaking, World Heritage Sites, Cornwall Council Historic and Environment team, and Natural England. Forestry Commission were going to come along, but unfortunately they're not able to attend. So as I say, quite a tight agenda. So each representative is going to do a 10-minute presentation. There's time for a Q&A afterwards. But this, I think, is going to be very much an overview of what the offer is at this stage. Just usual protocol. If when you're asking a question, you can put the hand up function and just introduce yourself and the organisation that you represent. Okay, that's great. And if I can hand over to you, Joe, that'd be fabulous. Thanks very much.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Joe Harris, and I'm the Senior Programme Officer for the Planting at Scale team for Forest for Cornwall. So basically that means myself and our team, our Planting at Scale team, are responsible for all large-scale rural planting projects, alongside a few smaller ones, and also our agroforestry exemplar project. I've got a brief presentation here. Apologies if you've seen it before, but it gives quite a neat overview of of the increased level of support we're now able to offer landowners, as opposed to the beginning years of the project. I'm just going to share my screen a minute, and hopefully that should come up. Can you all see that? Okay, so as I've just said, I'm going to talk about funding and support for planting at scale and agroforestry. A little bit of background about Forest for Cornwall. I'm sure many of you will be aware of Forest for Cornwall and have heard of it. It began a few years ago in 2019 as a project to encourage landholders and farmers to plant trees on their land in response to the climate emergency. We always had a aspirational target of 8,000 hectares of new canopy cover across the county by 2030. But I would stress that it was never intended that Cornwall Council would plant all those trees ourselves, or Forest for Cornwall more specifically, but more that the project was intended as a collaborative initiative where we would work with individuals and partner organisations to support them in their woodland creation projects. Back in those days, or up until this point actually, Forest for Cornwall has had a less tangible and more advisory function, in that people who wanted to plant trees would get in touch with us and we would offer them advice on tree planting, appropriate tree species to plant, and any grant funding that might be out there for their project. Beyond that point, there wasn't an awful lot of support we could offer in most cases, and it was observed that in a lot of cases, not an awful lot of tree planting happened. So the feedback we received from landholders as to why that was that it was actually the application process associated with a lot of woodland creation grant funding that was the most significant stumbling block to actually getting trees in the ground. So in recognition of that, the DEFRA Woodland Creation Partnership was formed, where Cornwall was identified as one of only 2 regions in the country to receive DEFRA funding for woodland creation and increasing canopy cover, the other one being Northumberland. So a collective pot of funds now sits between those 2 regions. Forest for Cornwall has successfully bid for a portion of those funds, And it's through that DEFRA money that we are now able to offer a more significant level of support through the Trees and Woodlands Fund and Agroforestry Exemplar project. And I'm going to go into both of those in a little bit more detail now. So first up is the Trees and Woodlands Fund, and this forms the kind of main thrust of our more typical planting at scale woodland creation work in the countryside. It has a budget of £1.672 million and is largely based around providing free consultancy expertise for landowners who wish to plant trees and through all stages of the planting project. So through the planning, through any grant applications that are needed, and also through the planting process if necessary. For the fund, we have a target of 125 site visits by 2025, and the sort of loose anticipation that around 80% will go on to plant trees, resulting in 235 hectares approximately of new woodland across the county. We intend for it to harmonise with and utilise the existing grant landscape. So as a result of that, the majority of our applicants will be steered towards and supported with sort of Forestry Commission England Woodland Creation offer funding, or the Woodland Trust More Woods, More Hedges funding. That's both so that we can maximise the positive impact that we have with the resources that we have, and also so that we're not confusing or competing with the existing grants that are out there for woodland creation. That being said, we can also direct fund any planting that is not covered by existing grants, which is great because it obviously allows us to pick up sort of smaller projects or less conventional proposals that would have otherwise slipped through the cracks. So things, as you can see, like field corners, orchards, shelter belts, and elements of agroforestry within a farm setting. This slide gives an overview of how we can support a typical inquiry that comes into Forest for Cornwall. So in the first box there, you can see an inquiry is made, and the easiest way for a landholder to get in touch with us is through the Contact Us page on our website, which is just a basic online form which asks you for a brief overview of your planting ambitions. One of our project officers will then be in touch with you to discuss your proposal in a little bit more detail and also give you an overview of how we might be able to support that. In most cases, we'll then go out and do a site visit where we'll introduce ourselves in person, look at the site, and gather enough information for us to produce what we call a desktop assessment. Any consultants who might be here, this is what we refer to as phase one. Which is essentially a screening exercise based on mapping, where we're looking at environmental opportunities and constraints associated with the proposed land parcel. And it functions as a general viability check for woodland creation for us to decide whether it's a project that's worth supporting. If we all agree that it has merit, then we will then hand over to one of our consultants. We now have a framework of 10 specialist woodland and forestry consultants on our books that we are working with. They will go out to visit the site, assess it in more detail, identify potential planting areas and potential funding, and they'll collate that information into a landholder report, which, as the name suggests, is a report mainly for the landholders' purposes, which will allow them to make a more informed decision about whether they want to plant trees. At this stage, the inquirer is not obliged to plant trees at all with Forest for Cornwall. This is a free service that we fund, as I said, to allow them to make a more informed decision. But if they wish to go ahead, the consultant would go back out, draw up detailed planting plans, carry out or commission any surveys required, so archaeological, ecological, any work required for an EIA, make grant applications and submit them. And hopefully, if they come back successful, then we can also help with securing a planting contractor if required. We can also fund a planting contractor if it's a project that we're directly funding, but in most cases, this will have now become an agreement between the landholder and whoever is awarding the grant funding, so Forestry Commission or Woodland Trust in most cases. And then the last stage, as you can see, all things being well, is planting. So that's sort of an overview of planting at scale, woodland creation. But alongside that, we are also running an agroforestry exemplar project, where we're aiming to obviously combine tree planting within productive agricultural systems. It has a £778,000 budget, and with that money we are aiming to establish 10 approximately 15-hectare agroforestry demonstration sites across the county. For each of those sites we will fully fund, so the 100% funded, the establishment costs, including capital items and also including expert consultancy support. We're also offering 10 years of maintenance payments to ensure that they have the best possible chance of success. We're also aiming to showcase the widest spectrum of agroforestry practice that we can with this project. So that can be demonstrated through the type of agroforestry that is being practiced, the geographical location of the farm, or any resultant business model that comes about through agroforestry practice. So just to clarify, we might well have more than one site based around wood pasture, but if they were opposite ends of the county, then they could well be facing very different environmental challenges, and they could also well have drastically varying business models associated with the use of wood pasture. So that would be absolutely fine for our purposes. In return, participating farmers will be asked to have somewhat of an open door policy to the wider farming community. So they'll be willing to allow other farmers on site to look at what they're doing, and also to share their experience both with farmers and with Forest for Cornwall, and by extension DEFRA. And the kind of information that we are asking for, we're looking for, is more on the kind of anecdotal social science and economic side of things. Basically, what was it like for those farmers transitioning from more conventional agriculture in a lot of cases into adopting elements of agroforestry? What worked, what didn't work, how were yields affected during that time of transition, and information along those lines, which will be fed back to DEFRA and, from what we understand, be used to inform future subsidy support for agroforestry in the UK. Yeah, that's an overview of our offer, and yeah, any questions, please?
Hi there.
Who's going first?
Stu.
Yeah, hi there. Thanks, Joe, for that presentation. Stuart Wood from Land and Heritage here. I've just got a quick question on the maintenance payments for the agroforestry. What are they per year?
£100 per hectare per year for 10 years.
Lovely, for 10 years. And just another question on agroforestry, on the silver pasture, safer wood pasture creation. What are the thresholds that you're sort of determining there, as in stems per hectare? Do you have?
We're going with the sort of Forestry Commission sort of definition of sort of the land classification for woodland. So aiming for sort of less than, well, up to 20% canopy cover, really. Yeah, or the potential to grow on to be, you know, to fulfill 20% of canopy cover. The inquiries we've had so far are generally going with about 80 to 100 stems per hectare. Okay.
Because there was a, yeah, I think the FC were kind of saying, was it 200 stems a hectare? I'm just trying to remember the threshold. So, but you're getting inquiries coming in at 80 to 100 stems.
Yeah, for us, we would still be aiming to sort of keep that agricultural land classification rather than it being, you know, classified as woodland for the purposes of EIAs and things like that. So it's also a lot more, it's a lot simpler if we can keep it to that.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay, great. If we've got no other questions, I can't see any. We'll hand over to Cornwall ANOB team. I'm not sure, is it Jim or Louise, or both of you presenting?
I think it's largely going to be me presenting, Jim Wood.
Right.
Although I'm sure Louise will help me along the way when I need some help. So I'm Louise and I are the two planning officers within the Cornwall Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty unit. We typically deal with development applications, but forestry, we're well aware, is becoming a much larger piece. So hence our particular interest in it. So I'll just try and share my screen, and if someone can give me a thumbs up or a nod, if you can see it, or just say you can see it.
Yeah, I can see it, Jim.
Perfect. Thank you very much. So this is about our view. We've become acutely aware of the growing interest in forestry and woodland creation, and our recently adopted management plan specifically has an individual chapter about this. That's a new addition to the management plan from the previous version. So it's something we're very alive to and take very seriously. We've slightly changed the order of this logo to be right place, right tree. For the AONB, it's all about landscape character and place, and therefore we've just, if there's one thing you take away from this for tree planting in the AONB, it's about getting the right place every bit as much as getting the right tree. So just a quick dash through. The area of outstanding natural beauty covers roughly a third of Cornwall. It's concentrated around the coastal margins, with the one exception to this being Bodmin Moor in the centre. And the purpose of the designation is what this all stems from, and it's about the conservation and enhancement of the natural beauty of the area, and it enjoys the same level of protection as national parks. So it is a very high level designation, and there are statutory obligations on the part of people who deal with matters within the AONB to have a duty of regard to the statutory purpose to conserve and enhance. So it really is embedded at the very highest statutory level that the AONB enjoys this level of protection. And within the AONB management plan that was adopted this year, a new principle has been established within the AONB that development, and I realise that often forestry isn't properly considered to be development, should be landscape led. And that's where landscape is the central underpinning of decisions within the AONB, rather than just being kind of a later consideration of, oh, does it tick the landscape box? Things should be absolutely landscape front and centre of everything. And that's what leads to this rearranging of this sentiment of right place, right tree. So really just to take you through the sources of information when you're looking at individual sites, we've got the AONB map. That is underpinned by the landscape character assessment for Cornwall, which I'm sure most of you will be familiar with. And that provides baseline information about the character and nature of the landscape. If I zoom in then to the section of the AONB that covers South Coast Central, so it almost extends to Truro, and it covers much of the Fal estuary. You can then zoom in onto the individual character areas, and these provide a really good source of background information when you're looking at sites. And this one, for example, is character area 13, the Fal Rea, Truro and Falmouth. And I'm sure a lot of you will be very familiar with these documents that are all available on the council's website. And they give you a really good description of the landscape character of the area. And having picked through the wording on here, I'm not going to talk through all of these things, but it's very clear about where the woodland is and equally where the woodland isn't. And this should provide a really good guide when looking at sites appropriate for woodland development or increase in woodland cover, to find those areas where that is already characteristic. Similarly, I could have picked a landscape character area where woodland cover was much less characteristic. There are a lot of areas within the AONB and indeed within Cornwall more widely where absence of woodland is one of the characteristic features. Then again, within the management plan itself, as I said before, it's divided into 12 separate areas, and each of the areas describes the special qualities of that area. And again, this provides a really good resource for understanding what's special about the landscape and what's the reason for its designation as an AONB. And that very much talks about land cover and areas of woodland, and particularly for this one, I've chosen, that it's very much emphasises the estuarine woodlands and the importance of that compared to the more open, more elevated landscape above that. And then within each of the different areas, there are also a series of objectives, and this one is specific about the management and extension of the sessile oak woodlands around the Fal. So they're part of the character of the landscape, but there's also an objective to manage them and extend them where possible. So this provides a really good opportunity for additional woodland planting to both sustain and reinforce the landscape character. So within, excuse me, the AONB management plan, as I said earlier, we've provided a new chapter that specifically addresses these issues. And although we haven't gone to the extent of a full woodland strategy for the AONB, we have looked in really quite simple terms, but to draw out some principles, how the AONB might be developed in terms of increasing woodland cover to still retain the important and protected elements of it. So this is very much a stylized representation of nowhere, particularly in the AONB, and we've looked at how the increase in woodland cover might retain the landscape character, but still allow for this increase in cover. So we're very supportive of an increase in cover as long as it retains the essential characteristics. And within the management plan, we identify 16 particular principles that we think are important. And I'll just whiz through them very quickly, looking at the comparison between the existing stylized one and the more heavily wooded one. So respecting open ridges and skylines, you can see even in the more wooded one that can work. The open setting of cultural heritage assets, again, very important to the character, and I'm sure some of my colleagues from the historic environment will come on and talk about that in greater detail. Reinforce and extend estuarine woodlands we've talked about. Again, that offers a great opportunity to reinforce the landscape character. In many places, the legibility of historic field patterns is very important, and even with the increase in woodland character, that's an important attribute and characteristic to retain. And then using locally characteristic tree planting to integrate development where settlements are being increased by using typical relationships with planting that can allow an increased development to be accommodated. Retaining the characteristic exposed moorland and coastal areas. I talked earlier that there are some parts of Cornwall that are characteristically treeless, and that should be retained. Reinforcing the pattern of Cornish hedges and tree clumps. Tree planting, as I'm sure the Forest for Cornwall agree, doesn't need to be necessarily all in blocks. It can be by adding to the existing structure of hedgerows, tree clumps, field corners and things. Looking at extending the riparian woodland. Agroforestry, which Joe talked about, you know, as long as it still retains the characteristic place within the landscape, that can work. Estate woodland is a very important feature in parts of the AONB, and the dynamic woodland moorland edge. You know, some of the most characteristic landscapes of the AONB are open moorland, and it's about not losing those, but allowing a dynamic moorland and woodland edge to happen. A restoration and expansion of ancient woodlands, again, can be accommodated within the existing character that's protected. Orchard development, new copses within the landscape where they could again form characteristic elements, and the inclusion of hedgerow trees. And then I think finally, connections between woodlands, you know, where there are opportunities that don't breach some of these other principles we've talked about, to look at where connections can actually add additional biodiversity value. So that's really our stall, that we passionately support additional tree planting for all the biodiversity benefits. We don't need to rehearse here, but it needs to be in the right place, and the clues for that are in the landscape character assessments and the special qualities that underpin the AONB, and by looking at the principles that will allow the character to be conserved and enhanced while still allowing for a greater forest estate. And to try and help ourselves and others who are applying for woodland creation within the AONB, we've produced a response template so that we look at each application on equal terms. This goes through the background to it, and this, I'm sure, if it's not currently available on our website, will be very shortly. But it also creates a template, and apologies for the resolution of this slide, that shows what we will be looking at when we go through and doing an assessment. So for us, it's all about right tree, right place, and right place, right tree, but also to use the underpinning evidence base of the landscape character assessments to determine where are the right places for woodlands, because there are right places and wrong places. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Jim. That's really, really helpful. And obviously gives us lots of scope for tree planting. Becky, if you want to come in with a question there.
Hi, yeah, just a quick question about the right tree kind of component. Are you thinking about, do you have guidance in there about kind of tree species and things, and how does that fit with kind of climate resilience and things?
We haven't gone to that level of detail of identifying tree species. I say we've produced these diagrams within the management plan to show the opportunities and some of the constraints. It's not the same as a full woodland strategy for the AONB, and I think we would probably defer to the silviculturalists to identify the right trees. For us, it's more about ensuring that the extent of woodland cover and tree cover is in the right places, and probably there are silviculturalists who can add more to the tree choice than we can.
Joe? You're on mute, Joe.
Sorry. Hi, Jim.
Hi.
Yeah, you kind of clarified this a bit for us before, but as we have many of our consultants here today, I think it'd be good to sort of revisit when, having seen that presentation I've just given about sort of our process and how we do things, when do you think is the best stage in our process for us to be consulting the AONB for your opinion on the Woodland Creation project?
I think inevitably the earlier you speak to us, the better. But I think if your proposals are all underpinned by the landscape character evidence base and the special qualities, and probably to a lesser extent the local landscape characterizations that have been undertaken by some of the neighbourhood development plans, that they'll already be very well informed by landscape character. But it is the landscape character is the protected element within the designated landscape, and it's really important that woodland creation enhances and reinforces that character rather than kind of flies in the face of it.
Right. I mean, is it explicit within each within the description of landscape character areas, what potential is there for expansion of woodland within each, or are we to take it that if they're just being quite black and white about it, if there aren't trees there, then there shouldn't be trees there, for example?
That's a really difficult one to answer. I think generally if it describes the landscape character as being exposed and treeless, that would be a very strong suggestion that adding trees to that landscape probably wouldn't be characteristic. And in very simple terms, in Cornwall, and you're all probably going to go, he can't say anything that general. Woodland in Cornwall is generally valley based, and I would suggest that if you're suggesting planting outside the valleys, you need to look at why that's a viable exception. And I accept there are lots of exceptions that are perfectly viable, but in very simple terms, an awful lot of the woodland in Cornwall is valley or lower slopes based, the major areas of woodland, and in the same way we're talking about right place, right tree. I would think, if a proposal comes forward on elevated land, you would immediately need to think very hard why not valley woodland is appropriate in that location. But I think the evidence base is very good in terms of the landscape character assessment, which is being rewritten by Cornwall at the moment, and the special qualities. That gives a very strong pointer. But if you find it's unclear, come and talk to us.
Okay, thank you.
Just to add to Jim there, if I may, just to emphasise, yes, the earlier you can come and talk to us, the better. And I think what we wanted to achieve by developing the template was to make the process more transparent, so that as well as helping to signpost people to the appropriate documents and guidelines to help support these proposals through the system, it was to help understand the rationale and the considerations we go through. So, I mean, certainly once it's up there on the website and any people has any feedback or questions, I think we'd be grateful to receive that too. We want it to work for everyone, essentially.
When is it going to be on the website, Louise?
I think I'm just looking to Emma on that, please.
Yeah, it can go on the website very, very quickly, and I'll put it in the group chat, but we'll share it with everybody on this call as well. But yes, it can go on the website very quickly.
Okay, Great. Thanks very much. That's great. So if we can hand over to Sally Weston for World Heritage Sites, that'd be great. Thanks, Sally.
Thank you. Try and share my. Hopefully people can see that. And now it's not responding. There we go. Oh. Apologies. What can people see at the moment? Because it's gone into a very weird view on my screen.
Looks fine on ours. Cornish mining, World Heritage.
In which case I'll just go with it and and hope it works as it's meant to. So the Cornwall and West Devon mining landscape was inscribed as a World Heritage Site in 2006. Similar to the AONB, it's a serial site, which means it's made up of several areas within Cornwall and West Devon, as shown on the map, which, oh, there we go, is hopefully on screen now. And I do apologise because my phone has now started ringing. I don't know if you can hear that. I will keep talking. It's one of currently 33 World Heritage Sites in the UK, and it's the largest industrial landscape at nearly 20,000 hectares, which is in multiple ownership and management interests. So we have a lot of people to sort of work with to keep it maintained. The management plan is designed as a framework within which the various management interests work to ensure that the internationally significant landscape is cared for and its importance is understood and celebrated in line with the obligations set out in the UNESCO Convention concerning the protection of world cultural and natural heritage, whilst also enabling it to adapt to meet the needs of the people who live in the site and as things develop. Our latest management plan also encapsulates the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. These activities sort of complement and contribute to looking after the site, and we make sure that our strategic aims sort of tie in with those. It includes things like climate action, life below water, life on land, and there's 17 goals. One of the targets within goal 10 around sustainable cities and communities sets out the requirement to strengthen efforts to protect and safeguard the world's cultural and natural heritage. So our role within the World Heritage Site is part of a wider commitment. The things that make it a World Heritage Site, its outstanding universal value, there are 7 attributes, and the 10 sites that it's made up of have the greatest set of these different attributes, and I'll run through those on the next few slides, which cover the period 1700 to 1914. The landscapes of Cornwall and Devon were radically reshaped during the 18th and 19th centuries by the deep mining for predominantly copper and tin. The remains of mines, engine houses, small holdings, etc., all reflect that extended period of industrial expansion and lots of innovation. As I said, the 10 areas include the greatest concentration of these 7 attributes. Our status is not statutory, and we can lose it if these attributes themselves are lost, whether through neglect or development, which erodes their existence. And the status also takes into account the World Heritage Site and its setting. So things that happen technically outside the border, it doesn't necessarily make it okay. We'd still want to have a conversation about the tree planting in this instance that might want to happen in the setting. So we've got mine workers' small holdings, which comprise small subsistence farms and their associated buildings where these survive. The image on the screen show clusters of small holdings at Carmanellis near Wendron and St Agnes. And with these and the subsequent images, I've tried to pick images that show the attributes, but also the breadth of the landscape types which sit within the site. So towns, cliff tops, moorlands, valleys. The next one is Great Houses and Estates, and these show Cateel and Scoria houses and their grounds. Scoria was built by mining tycoon John Williams, and the Portreath Mineral Tramway was the first of its kind and also attributed to him. Cateel was owned and developed by the Edgecombe family, who held significant financial interest in metal mining. The minerals and mining materials were shipped via Cateel Quay as well, which is also part of the estate. We've also got the ancillary industries, which includes foundries, engineering works, smelting works, fuse and explosive works, arsenic and chemical works. The images show the Poldice arsenic works in the Poldice Valley and the arsenic chimney at Devon Great Consols. There's a variety of mining transport infrastructure. That includes ports, harbours, wharves, quays, mine tramways, industrial railways, mine roadways, tracks and paths, and mining related canals. The images here show the Gonomena incline at Pontin's Piece, which is part of the Liskeard and Carridon Railway, and the copper ore docks at Morwellham Quay. Mine sites in which show the Cornish type engine houses and other mine buildings, including the chimneys or dressing floors, mine dumps and infrastructure, as well as tin salvage works and significant underground access. These images show Ding Dong Mine and the Con Pronta stamps in West Penwith. Mining settlements and social infrastructure, which is villages, hamlets, public buildings, Methodist chapels, preaching pits and new C of E churches. And these images show St Just and the industrial housing in Camborne. And last but not least is the mineralogical and sites of scientific importance. The image here shows Cligger Head, which is designated as a site of special scientific interest for its cliffs and adjacent mine workings, which have exposed grisand granite and rare minerals. So there's, again, this shows the sort of, you know, the variety of types of land that the site covers. And this image therefore then shows a few more things. The World Heritage Site, we advise on planting proposals made by both local authority and private interests. The advice has to consider the historic landscape baseline so as to ensure that any plantings do not erode the outstanding universal value, the attributes of which we've just looked at. An example where planting may cause concern would be where it's proposed on a former mine site, and that might, you know, drastically alter the character of the site. In most instances that we've seen so far, no objections have been raised, and on a couple of occasions we've worked with the applicants to work out the best route to ensure that planting can go ahead. We just need to make sure, as I say, that we don't lose the value of what's there, that's the attribute that's there. Each application, and similar to Jim has said, is considered on a case-by-case basis for its potential to the harm of our OUV. Areas of historic mine spoil are probably not suitable for tree or shrub planting, as these can cause harm directly to the attribute through it just being there, as well as detrimentally amending the landscape character itself. Plus there's, you know, a lack of soil for things to be planted into. So our plea really is to include us, or to continue to include us in the consultation at the earliest stage, and we can advise as best we can and help ensure that the planting can go ahead and not be detrimental to the World Heritage Site. Thank you, and apologies because the phone ringing completely threw me off then.
Well, that's great. Thanks very much, Sally. It's really, really helpful. I suppose the message again is like get those inquiries and questions in early, isn't it, to those relevant organisations.
Absolutely.
Is there any other questions for Sally? Go on, Joe.
Sorry, me again. Just Sally, you said about how you would like us to take into account the setting of the World Heritage Site as well, and I wondered if you have sort of any guidelines as to that, as sort of if you know how large an area are we talking about outside of the World Heritage Site, and you know how close would it have to be before we would, you know, consider the impact, basically, is what I'm getting at.
There isn't a sort of buffer zone, you know, for example, a 5-mile radius or anything like that. It will be case by case. So it will be things like if you suddenly block a view across mineworker small holding fields or something like that, that would be considered not ideal. So again, it will be case by case depending on the attribute and what would be changed or blocked by the planting.
Okay. Thanks.
Jenny?
So it's sort of a question, sort of just a bit of clarity. I'm just sort of thinking in terms of the idea of hopefully helping the land to actually long-term heal from all the industrial action that happens, and that possibly the introduction of some trees and hedges is actually really beneficial for that healing of the land.
Yeah.
And a great example of that would be somewhere like Kennel Vale, which used to be a very industrialised gunpowder works, and then it all blew up. But now it's a beautiful woodland where, you know, it's a real visitor attraction for that woodland and for the history, and it's a combination of the two. So
Yeah.
I was just sort of, I realise it's probably case by case, but I didn't know if you'd had an example of maybe where you might have identified that the planting of woods and trees have improved historic feature.
Not that we've seen thus far. So no, I've got nothing to offer up as an example of that from what we've been consulted on so far, I'm afraid.
Becky, your question there?
It's just a bit of a follow-on to that as well, is mentioning Luxillian Valley as being part of the World Heritage Site, but now the woodland and the woodland expansion and the secondary woodland throughout Luxillian Valley is now kind of an integral part of the nature of that site. But Luxillian Valley, even though it's part of the World Heritage Site, it's not typical of many of the other sites.
No.
So it's a good example in some ways and not a great example in the other, because we don't have many Luxillian valleys in Cornwall. But thinking about woodland planting being, you know, the right restoration for a site. Mining spoil and things has got so many other important and essential protected habitats, Calmanarian grassland and things like that.
Yeah.
That there are lots of other land management approaches that can be seen to be kind of complementary for nature recovery and for landscape that aren't necessarily, it doesn't just have to be woodland. We need to be thinking about our other priority habitats and vulnerable habitats in terms of land cover as well.
Yeah, and I think obviously that's a really good point in terms of us, you know, following up. There's so many different potentially conflicting or complementary activities. So yeah, getting the right tree in the right place, obviously key to any of our messages, isn't it? Okay, that's brilliant. Everybody's keeping to time remarkably well. Thanks very much. Okay, can I ask Anne to come in from the Historic and Environment team?
Hi, hi everyone, and it's really nice to actually see so many people and quite a few faces to names that so far I've just had email conversations with, so it's really great from that point of view. I will share this for you, just bear with me a second. Right. Oh, what can everyone see at the moment?
Yeah, designated and non-designated heritage assets in historic environment record.
Nice,
right?
Thank you. Yeah, thank goodness. Right. Okay, so yeah, so I'm the senior officer with the Strategic Historic Environment team with Cornwall Council. Also on the call is my colleague Emma Trevarthen, and between us you'll come across us doing the woodland consultations, but I think going forward, Emma will be doing a lot more than I have been doing up till now, but it's still the two of us as your main contacts to talk about. So I'm going to do a very quick whip through on this because it's such a huge topic. Now, I think to begin with, most of you, when you're looking sort of scoping out sites to start with, you will be looking at the historic environment record and the online mapping. So I've just put this up very quickly as a screenshot to show that it's a really good, it is a good start for the most up-to-date information that you could possibly get. But there is always a bit of a time lag with the information that does go onto the intranet mapping compared to the information that you can get directly from the historic environment record team. So you might be looking at an area that the actual real data set that we hold might have a bit more information there. So it's just outlining that it's always key to come and talk to Emma or myself, you know, about all the sites that are there, to make sure you're looking at everything that we do know about at that point. A few things to just point out as well when you're doing a quick intranet mapping search is that if you look on the key down here, there's a couple of hidden things that you might not really think about. One of those is event record down here. Now, and the event records actually cover reports, assessments that have already gone on a site, and they won't necessarily be reflected at all with the dot information that you see on the mapping. So it's always important to click on the event record and then click on your site and see if there is you know, there's been any archaeological assessment or walkover surveys that have been done before, because that will hold way more information than the actual point data on the mapping itself. So it's always a very important one to check. And the other one as well, which I think most of you are already using, is looking at the historic mapping too. Because quite often, particularly the Ordnance Survey mapping, there'll be sites on there as well that haven't yet been translated to point data on the HER. So it's always good to look at all those different mapping conventions as well to find out if there are more sites there. And obviously with the mapping here, the keys, you're going to be able to get all the designation information as well. So things like listed buildings, you do need to know where they are because there might be issues with setting. The aerial investigation, that's what all these lines are. These are sites that have been mapped from aerial photos. And then obviously the mining World Heritage site, so that's useful to feed into Sally's side of things. And then in designations hidden away, you've got scheduled monuments, which again, obviously very important to know where they are because they're obviously protected designated assets. But that one is hidden under designations rather than under historic environment. So just to be aware of that one. Now, so quickly, the designated assets, essentially, that's not Emma and myself. You'll have to go to other people for this, but it's worth knowing about. First of all, so scheduled monuments, that's Historic England. That would be Anne Preston Jones, which most of you know. Listed buildings. Now, if it's a grade 2 listed building, it's the Cornwall Council Heritage Planning Team, but grade 1 and grade 2 star, you'd need to go to Historic England. Registered parks and gardens, it's the same again, but in this case for grade 2 gardens you need to go to the Gardens Trust, but grade 1 and 2 star it's Historic England. Registered battlefields, you need to talk to Historic England, and then obviously you've just heard from Sally about the World Heritage site, so you're in line with who to go and talk to there. But it's worth noting that a site can be listed and scheduled. But in those cases, it's always the scheduling that takes top trumps, and so it'd be go and talk to Anne Preston Jones rather than anyone else on that. If you're ever not certain about who you should be going to talk to, you can ask Emma and myself, and we can signpost you to the right direction there. That's just a nice photo there of Treworth deserted medieval settlement up on Bobbing Moor. It's that you've got some commercial forestry around it, but you can see you've got the lovely settlement there, but more importantly as well, I guess you can see the associated field systems, and you can see the medieval ridge and furrow that's all associated with that as well, which is why we've had this really nice open area that hasn't been planted. So you can see the whole of that settlement site there. So yes, I've said a little bit about setting. Setting is quite important, particularly with designated sites. So it's something to bear in mind. Quite often prehistoric ritual sites are the ones to watch out for, because they're often related to things like natural features in the landscape. So the views from them will be very, very important. This is the Trippett stone circle out on Bodmin Moor, and this stone circle aligns with some nearby tors, natural tors, but it also links up with henges, the Henge Monument, and stone rows and barrows on the opposite moor as well. And quite often these they become apparent during certain times of the year, so they might have celestial alignments like summer solstice or winter solstice. But it's very important to try and think of those aspects when you're thinking about tree planting and planting design. So you've got the settlement, the feature itself, but then it is how that feature sits into the landscape as a whole. Parklands as well in particular are very important from that point of view, because they would have had views and vistas designed into the planting and the layout of the parkland, and that's what they would be the designation would pull out. So it's important to look at that in terms of planting and the historic planting schemes that went on there as well. Is it something that can be enhanced, but it's something that you need to be aware of, and also be aware of what particular point in time that a parkland might have been designated for, and to follow that planting scheme that would have been relevant at that particular time. Then with battlefields, they would have had defensive sight lines, which would be an important part of their designation. I've got an example here. Now, you can't see the site itself because it's behind us, so to speak, but these are the Forder musketry lines, which is a scheduled monument that overlooks Corsan Bay. And basically they're musket positions that were built into the hedges. And the whole point of that defensive line was to view the valley and the approaches coming up from Corsand, as that was integral to the importance of those scheduled monuments. But you can see here that someone's planted the start of an orchard, which, you know, in normal circumstances it would be absolutely fine. And at the moment it's not an issue, but you can see that once that becomes a mature orchard, it will break up that sight line that you would have got from the musketry position. So that would obviously affect the setting of that scheduled monument. So there, I think it would have been a case of, you know, good design and would have found a way around that. Undesignated assets, there are literally thousands of them in the historic environment record, and new sites are being added on a daily basis. Sometimes they're from excavation or survey work, but more often from sites reported by the public. So be aware that it is a constantly growing resource that we've got and information. And also be aware that what's recorded is quite often the tip of the iceberg for some sites. One of these, which is one that you may come across quite often, is prehistoric barrows. And I always say, just be suspicious if you've got a record of one barrow, because they were usually part of a wider cemetery. And the remains that you've got will survive really well underground, often cut into subsoil, sometimes even through bedrock. The example here is Wainhouse Corner, and you can see all of these red circles are all barrows, and it just gives you a general idea of the density that you would often get with a barrow cemetery. So even if one is just recorded, that's the sort of circumstance where I'd say, you know, look, actually there needs to be geophysical survey here. We need to know a little bit more about this area. There's a very good chance you've got more prehistoric features. Another example here, this is a 2,000-year-old settlement site, what we call rounds. One there, couple of smaller ones there, possible another one there, possible one there, and again with the associated field system with it. Now, at a ground level, you just can't see this at all. These all came up from aerial photos. So it was the only way you could see them pretty much from the sky to get an idea that they're there. Sometimes sites like this don't even show on aerial photos, which is, yeah, makes things quite difficult. And again, it's geophysical survey that will really help you identify what's there and the extent of the sites. But again, it gives you an idea where if we say, oh, look, there's a prehistoric round there, so you can just see, and you might just get the circular round itself, but it just shows you that the extent of related features that you could then have around one of those settlement sites. Both Jim and Sally have already spoken about field systems. Yeah, some areas we just have the most fantastic field systems, which are really important in terms of landscape character for Cornwall. They're really defining, and they just don't survive anywhere else up country to this extent. So that makes them really, really special and really important. Now this is Bezigran down in Penwith. It's a really obvious example, but it just shows you so well the importance of these field systems and how to keep the relationship of them as a landscape setting and the visuality of them. And Sally gave some lovely examples of the minor small holdings as well, where we've got perfect examples of those. Then, you know, we really want to keep them as great as we can, because they simply aren't replicated anywhere else in the country. So we need to preserve them and look after them. There's on a site-by-site basis, there's always the potential maybe for some planting, perhaps not in Penwith, this site here like in Penwith, perhaps not with some small holdings, but it's always worth negotiation. It's always worth having the conversation, but there will be some sites that, you know, really are just so unique and important that it would be difficult to try and put schemes into them. So moving very quickly on as well with the historic environment, we like to think that we can really add to opportunities in terms of planting, and it's all about design basically. Now this is the historic map of Penryn in 1880, and it just shows you the extent of orchards that were right in the core of the town at the time, which is absolutely phenomenal. The mapping that we did, digital mapping of Woodland, shows that there's been a 90% loss of orchards since 1880, which is absolutely phenomenal for Cornwall. But there, it's like, wouldn't it be fantastic if you actually had an urban forest by having all the plots behind, you know, the high street, all having one or two apple trees, so you create an urban orchard, and it's all different households, different business plots joining together to create that, you know, urban forest of Cornwall and recreating that important orchard scene. You've got St Gluvius Church as well on there. Up here, this is a parkland. It's not registered. It's now basically all farmland, open farmland. But again, you know, you can see there you could get plant trees and you could recreate that parkland. There's a good scope for enhancement there, and increasing tree cover. This is Devon. We all know it's Devon. I do apologise for that, but at the same time, it's one of the most perfect examples you could possibly get of something that you do get in Cornwall, eye catchers. This one here is actually, it's part of an estate, and it was built over a quarry, presumably to make the quarry look a little bit more scenic, I imagine. But now it's become a very iconic site for everyone coming back down to Cornwall. The similar ones along the A30, you know, where you might have Monterey pines. So, you know, look again at the surrounding landscape and think, in some cases, you know, was there a tradition of this? If there was a tradition, can we create eye catchers for the future? And then the history of the great plant hunters. There's been a tradition of exotics in Cornwall. The monkey puzzle is a great example, first coming to Pencarrow House. And then we've got now the Tregothnan Walloumi pine, the first one in the Northern Hemisphere to produce cones. So that tradition is continuing in some of the parks and gardens. But, you know, think about, especially with climate change, it's already been discussed, think about how you can fit these into local landscape character and use interesting species that may be more future-proof for climate change, but looking at the great gardens for inspiration, looking at the landscape character, and, you know, it is something that we have in Cornwall, is something that is historically been there, and these interesting species. So is there, you know, scope for doing that as well with planting schemes? And then finally, I've just done this quick checklist, which hopefully will be useful for you to go out and have a look and think about when you're out on site. So visible heritage, does it interact with surrounding landscape or other heritage features? What would effect would the mature trees have on it? That's the important thing. Think about mature trees. Invisible heritage, lumps and bumps, are they archaeological? Is there likely to be further ground remains depending on the site that's been found? Should there be more survey? Planting design, that's always the most important thing for us. But think about the extent of mature roots on a site, because again, if it's below ground archaeology, you might be able to plant trees, but you've got to be able to take things like mature root span into account. The design, absolutely. The effect of different species on local character, potential for new species, eye-catcher clumps or exotics in the area that you could carry forward for future planting. Parkland, ornamental grounds, what was part of the design, other views, vistas to take into account, and then history of orchards or wood pasture that you could take forward, and how would they help complement the local landscape character. So that was that. I felt like a whistle stop. It might not have been, because I had absolutely no idea of the time while I was doing that. So there we go.
Doing great.
I think the key is design, and it's also, yeah, Emma and I were here to be talked to, and as early as possible, we're happy to talk through projects.
Fantastic, thanks, Anne. That was really fascinating. Okay, unless there's any urgent questions coming up, no, I don't think so. We'll pass on to Becky from Natural England. I assume it's you, Becky, who's presenting. And yeah, great. Thanks very much. Pass over to you, Becky.
Yep, brilliant, thanks. Yeah, Martin and I are going to do, well, I'm going to do the presentation. Martin, who's my colleague in Natural England, working on tree action plan delivery. He's got a few slides, and then I'll just take over to talk about landscape. Luckily, most of you have all said what I was going to say anyway, so we should be quick. Can you see? It says PowerPoint live to me. Give me a thumbs up when something comes up.
Yeah, we see that, Becky.
Okay, brilliant.
Yeah, thank you. Right, hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Martin Longley, Natural England, and I'm working on the tree action plan. So lovely photograph there of Wisman's Wood on Dartmoor. Next slide, please, Becky. So you kind of know all this already, but the England Tree Action Plan came out last year, 3-year plan. And we've been tasked by DEFRA to work very closely with Forestry Commission and other stakeholders to basically achieve these very ambitious woodland creation targets. Natural England are very tasked with maintaining the biodiversity and public interests of particular sites. I'll come on to that in a minute. And always looking at the nature recovery potential of any new woodland creation. And it's not just woodlands, it's wood pasture, hedgerows, scrub, the whole kind of shrubby environment we're interested in. So what do we offer as Natural England? We have a free of charge consultation service. So it can just be a landowner, it can be an agent, it can be Forestry Commission. They can come to us free of charge with their proposals really early doors, and we can do a desk-based study. And if we think it's of importance that we need to get out and do a site visit, that's all free of charge. And the good thing is that we have a 20 working day turnaround time. So and if we miss that, we get told off greatly by DEFRA. So we turn these consultations around really quickly. On our site visits, we can rule in or rule out some woodland creation proposals based on what we find in terms of habitats, for example, but we may also suggest further surveys are needed if there's something of particular importance. So ecological surveys could follow after we've done our initial survey. And also part of my role is to get involved with these delivery partnerships. So like today's meeting, basically, so involved and trying to enhance and influence woodland creation in I work across Devon and Cornwall. Next slide, please. Right, so really simply, the things that Natural England are interested in are the 5 Ps. So we have to look at peat. We don't want woodland creation on peat or peaty soils. Protected sites, they're the jewels in the crown, so we have to look after them. So if there's any woodland creation on a protected site like a triple SI or adjacent to, then we would be very interested and we'd go out and check that there wouldn't be any impact on those protected sites. Priority habitats, that's something we're looking at when we're out on site to make sure that we're not putting trees in the wrong place. We're looking after our very important habitats. And similarly with species, so picture there of a wading bird, but it could be bats, it could be waxcap fungi, it could be anything. And then the 5th P is public access. So we're making sure that public access isn't prevented by any new woodland creation, and we're also looking for new opportunities to allow communities and public into new woodland creation projects. Next slide, please. Just something we do internally as well. So all our work is obviously to do with nature recovery. So you'll have heard about the Nature Recovery Network. So we're looking to try and influence where woodlands can be put into the landscape and connect up existing woodlands with hedgerows and such like. I'm doing a lot of work with our sort of internal advisors. So we have catchment sensitive farming officers and also agri-environment scheme officers who are out and about on farmlands every day, and so a lot of training for them to make sure they understand the importance of trees, hedgerows, woodlands within their schemes for all the host of beneficial reasons. And also another project working on currently are our triple SI woodlands. So these are the really important woodlands, Devon, Cornwall. So looking at where they are, what are the threats and the opportunities to the woodlands? Can we buffer them? Can we expand them? So working with landowners around those triple SI woodlands to try and get some really targeted woodland creation. Next slide. Right, it's my last one. So that's my details. There's an embedded link there, which is our pro forma sheet. So if anybody wants to get in touch with us, there's that pro forma sheet. Really basic, you fill that in, you ping it off to that email address at the bottom there. And as I said, we get back within 20 working days. And we, please get in touch with us, whether you're agents, Forestry Commission, stakeholders, whatever. Our doors are open. That's me done, Becky. Thank you very much.
Well, shall I crack straight on, or do you want to? No immediate questions, are there? I'll crack straight on, and then Martin and I can chat at the end. I'm Becky Hughes, Strategic Landscape Advisor for Devon, Cornwall and Isles of Scilly, Natural England Area Team. So my main role is to support all of our AONBs and national parks in achieving their landscape and statutory duties, really. So I'm helping with management plans, with involvement, inclusion, coordinating nature recovery plans, lots of different things like that. So the topic of woodland and woodland creation and woodland expansion and the impacts on landscape is something that's a priority for our area team as well. So yeah, I don't get involved in necessarily in delivery, so in consultations and things like that. That's Martin's area of work, but I'm here to kind of help and support talking about various different issues that might come up. So when we're talking about landscape, really, if you ever attend a Natural England webinar on landscape, this little diagram will pop up. The elements that make up landscape, when I'm talking about kind of landscape character and landscape uniqueness and landscape qualities, is is not just the underpinning physical aspects, the geodiversity, the biodiversity and the land use, but particularly as well the history and the experiential elements of that landscape. And all of those factors together are what, when we're talking in a strategic way, that's what we're talking when we're thinking about landscape. So all the things that we want to consider when we're trying to achieve better outcomes for landscape. And I think some of the issues that we're looking at is like for individual schemes, the site design process and the consultation process and things can really be in a lot of cases quite robust. You know, UKFS has got great design guidelines and things like that. And as we've heard today, there's a plethora of people out there to talk to about an individual scheme. But are we addressing the cumulative impacts of all of those schemes over time, and what all of these individual agreements and individual actions might add up to over a landscape, and are we doing that in a coordinated way? So that's one of the areas I want to look at. We've already mentioned, you know, using landscape character assessments and things to try to understand which landscape character types or character areas are more sensitive to an increase in canopy cover, and what character areas might be able to absorb and in fact benefit from a lot more woodland cover. And so how do we use woodland and things as well to conserve and enhance the heritage? We've got a great internal document, and I'm going to find out if we can share it. It's called Knowing the Past to Understand the Present and Plan for the Future, Managing the Historic Environment and Shared Plans for Places. And so that's a good kind of guidance document which really helps us integrate heritage into all of our land management decisions. So those are areas that I'm thinking about when we're talking about woodland, not necessarily targets on tree delivery and things like that. And so I think this is my question, and I've seen some answer, you know, potential answers, and part of the puzzle today is what is the best way to achieve this, you know, us all working together in a best practice way going forward. Devon are developing a new woodland strategy with the Woodland Trust and things. It'll be interesting to see how that pans out, another written strategy, whether that answers these problems and gets us around these obstacles. Is mapping a way forward? Do we want some good visualization tools and animations and other kind of technological approaches? Is it guidance notes from the likes of Natural England, expert advice? Is it more kind of stakeholder workshops like these where we can talk about, you know, how to interpret a landscape character assessment, or, you know, what areas we're thinking about, or more understanding the heritage? So that's what I'm looking for. What actually will help us achieve what we want to achieve, and not just be a written document on a shelf or a PDF saved in a OneDrive. So yeah, and sense of place. I think this is, you know, this is kind of one of the elements of landscape that, you know, is really kind of ticks a lot of boxes, is, you know, understand, we've seen, you know, we've talked about setting, we've talked about context and the experience of being in certain places. And we really need to understand and recognise that kind of woodland expansion and canopy, it's very positive for this in a lot of ways, but there are certain places and situations where trees, woodland and forestry in particular will have an impact. Up above Sibleyback in the summer, I thought Sibleyback was empty then. It's probably looking a lot more empty now. Across Bodmin Moor, you can see all, you know, probably all the different types of woodland and forestry that you would want, all in kind of one view, one single view from the top of a tour. And there's looking at, I've got a lot of images in here, and you're looking through the images, you can really easily start to pick out what is characteristic, what is jarring, where there might be room for more landscape. And this is what's made me think of kind of visualization tools and having a library of good images that will be really effective communication tools for us with our colleagues, but as well as with, you know, with landowners, understanding the impacts of commercial forestry plantations, starting to really explore where there might be room for more trees and woodland and how that might enhance the landscape. So I was thinking about sense of place, and I was trying to think what really, when I think of how trees and woodland make a landscape, what are the examples that I think of? And these are just a few that I came up with from areas and places that I've worked in. The coastal Atlantic woodland, the lichen draped stunted oak woodland, as a bit like Wistman's Wood, as Martin showed at the beginning, but we also get that on our kind of our coastal fringes and things as well. The orchards of the Tamar Valley, and Isles of Scilly as well. The non-native green fences of Isles of Scilly are now an integral part of the landscape. It might not be necessarily what we choose to do now, but that, you know, that approach to agroforestry has become part of the landscape character. And so it can be really, really distinctive. And for example, if anyone knows South Yorkshire, the hagwoods that kind of fringe the edges of the Peak District, with kind of mature oak stands with a holly understory, don't just define the landscape, but they tell the story about how farming and livestock were managed around the edges of the peak. The holly was grown for forage and the oak were grown for shelter and for firewood. So as you're walking through these lovely, unique and wonderful woodlands, you're not just enjoying the aesthetic and the nature of the landscape, but you're experiencing the heritage and things as well. If anyone's been to Scilly on a plane and kind of pressed their camera up against the window trying to get some pictures, this is what you'll see. So this is St Martin's, and you can see really distinctively the densely planted green fences, as they call them, of the non-native, highly invasive Pittosporum shrubs, which, whilst they are enabling farming on the landscape and you know, creating the unique microclimate of the Isles of Scilly, the highly invasive nature of those species are now affecting priority habitat, heathland and seabird nesting sites and things like that. So it's a really interesting situation about when do trees and shrubs, how do we value them, and how do we manage that value and place boundaries around it. But yeah, thinking within Scilly, where would there be room for more woodland and more canopy, and would it fit with the character of the landscape? You probably can't take 2 steps on Scilly without tripping over some sort of heritage feature anyway. So we do need to find a way forward to, you know, find spaces for trees and woodland in our landscape. This is Exmoor, and yeah, again, a tree that wouldn't possibly naturally be found in that situation and in that alignment and that planting design, but really kind of unique to Exmoor and the fringes as well. So going forward, do we respect that and try and enhance and replicate those historic planting designs, or do we look to try to develop a new landscape that's more appropriate for the future, considering climate change? It's all kind of, I think, flexible questions that I'm trying to tease out how different AONBs and national parks are approaching that. So we've talked about a lot of these resources, so I won't go over them again, but you know, there really is an amazing archive of resources that are there to be drawn on. One of the questions I'm wondering now, not being a landscape professional myself, is that how really kind of accessible is the language that we use when we're talking about landscape? If someone's not familiar with that, maybe there's not an easy way to interpret a landscape character assessment. Maybe we need to be making it a bit more user-friendly, a bit more bite-sized, or really giving some good examples of, you know, these types of lines within a landscape character assessment mean yes to woodland in this scenario. Maybe we need, you know, we need landscape professionals to make that jump for landowners and for farmers and for agents and things. Lots of situations where we do have trees and woodlands in Cornwall, and sometimes, you know, they're absolutely crying out for areas where we can fit in more planting, and we could maybe even explore some unusual kind of planting designs. Helmantor view back over to the edge of clay country and kind of South Cornwall is top left. Right, that's the River Foy and Pontpill, and you know, there's blatant gaps of fringing, you know, deciduous woodland there. Bottom left, that's a view of the edge of the in-by land of Bodmin Moor, and there's quite a few different interesting projects going on in Bodmin Moor, looking at woodland expansion and canopy expansion. And then we've got Boscastle bottom right, and you can see, you know, an inappropriate planting scheme could really have a very far-reaching impact on the landscape of the area, the heritage of the area, but perhaps also the experience of people walking the coast path, and it could impact on the landscape and on the seascape for many miles on a good day. on a normal day, you wouldn't see it until you walked into it, but on a good day, we can see a long way. This is Piles Copse in Exmoor, and I just kind of, not Exmoor, Dartmoor. So I included a Devon photo as well, Anne, so it's not just you. But to see, this is Piles Copse is a great example of how woodland and natural regeneration and different types of woodland could be and can be expanded into the upland landscape, and that can enrich woodland character. You can see how this kind of natural regen and scrubby secondary woodland ends very abruptly at the field line there. I'm pointing with my own mouse and I've just realised that you can't see it, but it doesn't matter, I'm sure you're all very well experienced. So you could look at the upland area and just use, good images as a tool for explaining how, reassuring people really how trees and woodlands can be added into and enrich a landscape, much in the way that we saw in the AONB management plan earlier. Thinking back there to Martin's protected species, this valley in particular is one of the areas where whinchat are finally clinging on around the edges of Dartmoor. And whinchat love to use the bracken and the open grassland. They do like trees, but they're a bird that loves kind of the edge of the open moorland. So if we planted up Piles Copse, or if we encourage natural regeneration, would we be pushing the whinchat out of one of their last strongholds on Dartmoor? So it's a delicate balance, really. Really just wanted, because we've been talking about agroforestry, really just going to whiz through a key example of how we're thinking about landscape and agroforestry planting in a strategic way. So agroforestry is different, it's different from woodland creation and woodland expansion. It's can have a highly artificial and highly modified designed impact on the landscape. And this is Wakelands. This is up in far in the east, so we've gone way even out the southwest here, and it is an extreme example, but I've just included it here. If you imagine this was the Yorkshire Wolds or somewhere, another protected landscape like that, where an inorganic kind of planting design can really have a high impact on the landscape. It could be positive, it could be negative, but it's different, and that particularly within our areas of outstanding natural beauty, what capacity is there for us to introduce elements that aren't necessarily traditional or aren't necessarily natural, in inverted commas? How do we deal with that? And particularly for agroforestry, it's interesting because we're thinking about, geometric planting patterns. We're thinking about perhaps non-native species with an unusual outline or an unusual growth pattern, which could be really jarring on the eye and could, really, particularly with thinking about tall, pointy trees, could have an impact much further than our native orchards would do. And so what do we do? Do we respect the traditional approach, or do we look to the future and say, well, for our landscapes to adapt and to evolve and to become more climate resilient, and for our farm and our land management businesses to be able to survive into the future, do we have to come to terms with, accept and embrace these new elements of land management? So just some different examples of agroforestry. Those are the cork oak pastures of Portugal, so which are a key part of, it's an agroforestry scheme, but it's a traditional heritage land use, and it's an integral part of landscape, a unique landscape character. But even, these created parklands, which we have a lot of in our countryside as well, are a part of landscape character, but they are agroforestry schemes and looking quite natural and quite organic, and could even be a product of natural regen and would fit quite nicely into a national character area, perhaps. And then we look at the more, I don't like using the word artificial, but I haven't managed to think of a better one. And you can see how this different approach to agroforestry can have a real impact on the landscape and on the setting and on the context. So particularly in our designated and protected landscapes, when we're talking about agroforestry, what exactly are we thinking about here? I think we need to look to places like Dartington, Shillingford, I think is one of these, and thinking about the species, thinking about the land use as a whole. So kind of intercropping with lavender, it could be a really appealing diversification for a farm in Cornwall. We've got the lavender farm, not sure where it is, but it could be a really appealing diversification. We could be seeing some of our traditional, I'll just go back to that one, some of our, our traditional local industries of brassicas or daffodils planted up in between, a non-native species as a nurse crop or something like that. But thinking about the planting design and how far that can be seen, particularly with our AONB, is this a change in landscape character? How do we embrace that? And again, reflecting back to look at the past, I think is a good way. Anne's already mentioned, orchards in Penryn, and I would be thinking about kind of the cherry orchards of the Tamar Valley and things. But it is a question, it's grappling around how I think a lot of the obstacles can be overcome through good support and good advice and guidance. But if agroforestry was to be available through a land management scheme where the landowner was able to sidestep perhaps checks and balances that are applied in a lot of the schemes, and was able to implement an agroforestry scheme that many of us would think inappropriate, how do we apply that certainty to make sure that we are not, making the same old mistakes again? And so that's really what I'm trying to think about in terms of my strategic support to AONBs. And that's it really. Just a lot of pictures. Don't know, again with Anne, don't know how long that took, but
okay, great. Thanks very much, Becky. I'm conscious of time and I've got another meeting to go to shortly. I think it was a fascinating whistle-stop tour, and I think obviously quite a lot of significant questions raised in terms of going forward. I know I did talk to the Woodland Trust about tree strategies last week, so it'll be interesting to learn from what comes out from Devon, because I'm sure as all of you have had strategies sit on a shelf and actually don't do anything. So it's quite interesting conversations to have around that. We will be sharing some information. I know Emma's sort of included that in the chat, and there will be the webinar to go back to. I think we'll have a think with our partners just about in terms of how we perhaps go forward, if people would want future workshop type spaces to discuss and chat through ideas. If that's interesting or relevant, then please let us know at Forest for Cornwall, and we'll come back to you perhaps for any feedback for additional things that perhaps you might like to ask that have not had the chance to. But I think key to this is obviously being very very thoughtful about how you're planning your planting design, also being creative about that, but also again coming back to those people, the experts in their various fields, to actually get that information and background information as early as possible. So given it's bang on 2 o'clock, thank you very much for all your time. Thank you very much for the presenters, and we'll get back to you with some perhaps follow-up thoughts, questions to take this forward as we look forward to more tree planting in the right place. All right. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.